husband was at St. Anthony's Hospital, and I was leaving home, going to a church to do a funeral, and had to stop by St. Anthony's where a member eventually died. And then I had to go do a funeral. I had come back from a funeral. We were at the church. You know, preachers like to eat, and we like to feed them. And they were feeding after a funeral. We had come back, and I was in the fellowship hall eating, and there was a phone call. Just buried someone to inform me that there had been another death. There was not time for grieving, which I think is significant when you start looking at and you start trying to examine what happened on that day. So it tells you a little bit about who I am and where I come from. I was a chaplain of St. Anthony's for many years. I loved chaplaincy. I loved it because one of the best things I always thought about chaplaincy was I loved being able to come into a room or being called in on an emergency. And you know what? As a chaplain, you only have a few moments to convince someone that you are not there to poke, tug, pull, stick. You're just there to say, how are you and what can I do to help you in this moment? And to convince them that that's all you've come to do. And so I love chaplaincy work and only went away from that when I went full-time at the church back in 2000. And so it was just a great work. I loved it. I mean, I really loved it. And obviously one of the moments, there were a lot of good moments. One of the moments that stand out to me was that day at St. Anthony's Hospital. I was down in the cafeteria, 902. I should have been working. Quit it. Yeah, I know. I should have been. 902. I was eating breakfast, so give me a break. I was eating breakfast. And that was what I was sitting with a couple of folk at a table with me, and it felt like as if something upstairs had exploded. And I knew the lab was upstairs and everything. So I didn't get overly excited, but it was a pretty good shake. And for those of you who don't know, you could probably look out and see St. Anthony's from here. It's close proximity. And when it shook, I sat there for a while with the other folk, and we all started, speculating about what that could be. And we knew some of the people who worked up in the lab, and we thought they had blown something up. And it had been very serious at that point. So I heard we would have known that in an instant they would have come over the loudspeaker with the code for an emergency, or they would have called the folk who were necessary. Well, it didn't. For a while, nothing happened. So we assumed, okay, then things kind of settled down. Some light bulbs fell out. So it was a fairly significant shake. We didn't, and I'm from Memphis, I got to tell you, so it didn't shake me, because if you brought up in Memphis when I was brought up in Memphis, it takes more than a little shaking to get you to start running and ducking. You might just stay where you are. That's probably the best thing to do. So don't move. So I didn't move. Matter of fact, some of the folk at the table did jump up, to be honest with you, because it was that significant, and thought nothing of it. It had to have been another 10 minutes when they came over, and I'm not going to tell you because they may be still using the same word to signal to us that there has been a significant emergency. And so when it came over, those of us who are service personnel, such as chaplains and those support personnel, we are to report directly to our office. Well, my office was right outside of the cafeteria. And so when I jumped up, when I heard it, I knew something was wrong. And I jumped up, went to the office and went in there. And by the time I got there, the other 5 or 6 chaplains had arrived. There was still no word about what was going on. The director was there, and she said, I don't know. They just told us to come, and they told me to get here and be ready for what was going on. Well, about that time, the secretary, who had a television outside in the waiting room, said, come and look. And we came to see it, and we saw then what had happened. There was still speculation about what had happened, a gas line or whatever, and so no one knew what was going on, and we were all there glued to the TV when our director got another phone call, and it was then informed to her what had occurred to the best of the ability of those who were on site to tell us. And the reason she was told was, obviously, St. Anthony's and their proximity to the Murrah building, we were going to be some of the first folk who were involved in this incident. And so our director started assigning folk, and lo and behold, they sent folk to different areas of the hospital. And my assignment, George, I want you to go into the triage area in the emergency room. For those of you who may not, that's where they designate what type of care will be taken on individuals who were brought in. And so I was assigned to the area that people would be directly brought into. And so I hurried down to the ER, and when I got there, I contacted the ER director because that was my job. Tell I'm here. She said, okay, George, we know, wait a minute, we're going to have a brief meeting to tell you what we expect. They got us together, about all of the ER nurses and some other nurses and several doctors were there, and they brought us together in a small room and said, listen, there's been a tragedy. They're going to be bringing, from what we know, at least, and I need you to catch hold of this, at least 2 waves of individuals. We know that much already, because one of the waves are already on the way. There will be at least 2 waves that we know will be coming. And from all indications, they will be fairly severe in what has occurred. And so they start assigning folk. My job was to be there with the folk as they came in, so that I would do the work of a chaplain in not doing any medical stuff, but doing what I just told you. How are you doing? What can I do for you? And to be there as they came in, to keep them comfortable, to keep them as best I could until the doctors and nurses could assign them to the different rooms. This was my first time ever. I didn't serve in the military. There was 9 folk in my family and 6 boys. And out of those 6 boys, 4 of the boys and my daddy 4 of the boys and my daddy served in the military. I had 2 brothers, one who retired as a lieutenant colonel and another who retired as a full colonel. One brother was a Green Beret. My father was over in Germany. I didn't go into the military. I have no idea about war. I have no idea about what that looks like, what it feels like, what it seems like. But I had several of those brothers. Matter of fact, my year of birth was when they did the lottery. When I turned 18, it was the last year of the lottery. My number was like 168 or something, and I was going to college. So there was even no danger for me to go to Vietnam. It was the last year of Vietnam, but there was still no danger for me to be drafted. And so I have no earthly idea what it feels like, what it looks like, what the thought is, what the environment is of war. Let me tell you something. When they started bringing those individuals in, the first thought that crossed my mind was, this has got to be the way it looks from the effects of war. There is no way for me to adequately describe not only the physical condition. Literally, folk hair was full of glass, literally. There was blood everywhere. Clothes were torn and ripped. But what was most pressing on my spirit at that time was the look in their eyes. And remember, doctors and nurses were there to do what? To care for those folk in the medical manner in which they had been trained. I was there to look into their eyes and attempt to the best of my ability to give them some comfort in a moment where comfort was probably the last thing that was on their mind. And I still had no idea what they had gone through. But looking into their eyes impacted me that I will never, ever, even the physical effects. I mean, if you can literally think, folk who were dressed like me that morning, and I mean have on half a suit, half a shirt, half a pair of pants, some folk without shoes, some folk with one shoe on, some folk even with one sock on. I mean, it was just total. I mean, it was more than anything I could understand in my mind. And it was not my job. It was not my job to determine where they were hurting, except in a spiritual way. I took that on. I saw it right away. I took that on. It's the only thing I can do. I'm not a doctor. I really don't know. Where it hurt wouldn't help me at all if you pointed it out, but I can see in your eyes. And so the first thing that I discovered as I started talking to these individuals who were, I mean, they were in a state of shock, was that, listen, you're not going to be able to get much except to let them know that you are here. want you to hear that, to let them know that you are here, because literally they did not know where they were. After this event, these folk were complete. So you get different characteristics, different personalities. Some folk ask me about their families. Some folk ask me about their children. Some folk ask me, where am I? Some folks ask me, what happened? And so you get an idea. You get an idea then of what was happening. And yes, for a while I was the only chaplain there, which was an impossible situation because obviously I couldn't see this first wave of all the folk who came in, and they were, I mean, it was really, it was overwhelming, to be honest with you. Stacy invited me to come, and she didn't tell me what to say, and so I can say what I want to say and tell you why. And I will have to say to you, in all honesty, if you ask me those first few hours, how did you really make it and what really clicked in, to me, to be perfectly honest with you, I could not answer that except to say, there is a God in heaven. If you don't believe in God, that's fine. I'm telling you, for me, because people were literally, staff, personnel, were literally hunting me out, saying, would you please come and talk with this person? Would you please come? So again, remember the first my illustration I started this off with about not being able to grieve. Think about not being able to fully engage folk except to help them to understand. And let me tell you, there is a difference between someone patching you up, putting some stuff on you, taking glass out of your arm and asking you, does it hurt? There's a difference between that and someone letting you know that they are there. And that was my job. Simply, I wasn't trying to take on anything more than that. I wish I was smart enough to tell you I knew that was my job when I started doing it, but I did not know it. I realized that that was the best outcome I could get out of this whole event at that moment, which I didn't have any idea how long it would last. But listen, the best thing I can do is to let these folk know that I am here. One of the things that will always stand out at me is there was a mother who had a child, and this child couldn't have been no more than 2 or 3. And I say this, and I don't want anyone to think wrongly about it, but I say this because I think it helps in the understanding. They were white. Little 3-year-old girl. Her hair was not as bad as her mother. Her mother was badly hurt, but her mother was able to talk, and the girl was there with her. The doctor said to me, we need to take the mother back so that we can help her, but we cannot take the child back with us. Can you see if you can get this child to go with you? Now, I hope that you're already with me, that you're understanding the scene, and something like that occurred, that the mother and daughter were together when it occurred. So now they want me to separate this child from her mother, who is concerned. The child was not hurt as bad as the mother, not at all, matter of fact. And they want me to separate this child from this mother. I wish I could go back through and tell you all the things that happened. All I remember is leaning down to that mother and saying to that mother, I think you know that the doctors need to, and she was hurting badly. Yes, she said, they've asked me to take your child, and I will have your child with me, and I promise you I will keep your child with me until I bring your child back to you. But you're going to have to help me to get her to understand that if you're going to get help, she's going to have to go to me. I didn't have grandchildren then, let me tell you that. Now, I got grandchildren. I was on a plane yesterday, flying back in, 2 little girls sitting in the seat, the stewardess, the Southwest airline person, sat the 2 girls next to me, and 2 young girls, they were really young, maybe 5 and 6, and I got grandkids now. You know what? I helped them with the seat belts, and they gave them my peanuts, and we were just talking. They asked me what I'm reading. We were just getting along fine, because I'm a grandparent. I know how to do that stuff, and they were fine offering me their stuff, I didn't want to eat it, We had a good time, but I was not a grandparent then. And I really didn't know what to do. Was still trying to be a parent. And eventually, this girl released her mother, and I got her. And for the next 2 hours, I walked around with this girl on my hip. And the most interesting thing about that is that when I was stopping and talking to folk, she was the most helpful person in all of this. Because as I was trying to talk to folk and just say, listen, there has been something that happened. We know you don't quite understand it. They'll get to you in a minute. Anything I can do for you in the water. She says to them, you're going to be all right. And I never stopped her because it was very helpful to them to break through what they had gone through. Is anybody catching already when I say to you, for me, I know there's a God? Because that helped me to be able to do what I had been called to do. Anyway, eventually, a few hours later, I returned the child back to her mother, and the child thanked me and said, when are you coming back to get me next? She's probably a chaplain now somewhere doing good chaplaincy work. You could imagine that whole day from that point on, whole day, to the night. But let me tell you, there was a little break. After that first wave came, and we got through, I can't remember how many folk it was that we actually saw during that period of time. But after we saw that first wave, this is important because I told you a few years ago, we were expecting 2 waves. After that first wave, had to be somewhere 1 o'clock by the time we stopped, and the question was asked, did they send the other folk to another hospital? Now, I told you about what time it was, 1 o'clock, so it was enough time. If it happened at 9 o'clock and it's 1 o'clock now, those folk should have been seen. So the assumption was when we had a break and when people were talking to me and I was asking them, second wave, where they go somewhere else, they didn't bring them to us. There was a lull, and this is the moment that I will remember as one of the significant moments, because the ER, the head of our emergency room department, who was head of triage, says to all of us in that room, there will be no second wave. And we said, well, why? It's a logical question because we want to work there. He said the second wave were those individuals who had been caught in the building. The people we saw were the folk who were outside of the building. Well, we did get some of those folk in the second wave. Later that day and the next day, and this went on all night before we transferred over. And I know Ms. Kernan is here from the church, Polly is here from the church, before we transferred over to the church and some other places to see family, which I hadn't gotten to yet. Let me know how my time is going. And so we still had folk who were coming to the hospital looking for individuals because we were the closest hospital. A lot of folk would come there. The other major thing that stands out in my mind happened the following day. The following, and some of you may remember the statue or the picture of the fireman holding the little girl who came out, because that's one of the etches that was just kind of inevitably grained into our minds. I had the opportunity, and listen, don't get me wrong when I said blessing, because to me, it is a blessing to share with folk in the midst of whatever they're going through, and for them to allow you to do it as a pastor, as a chaplain. It is a blessing for someone to trust me to the extent to be with me. That mother came, and I was called to go up to where they were holding bodies to be with that mother until they prepared the room for her to go in and to see her daughter. This was a whole nother day. And as I sat there with that mother, and it was one other family member with her, a day later, the question she asked me is, how is my baby doing? It still hadn't set in what had occurred. So they called me and said, okay, this is about the best we can do. Come in. They took me in first, and I looked at the baby, and I knew this would be a very traumatic moment, because it for a mother to look at her child in this way was going to be very difficult. If you didn't know her, you wouldn't be able to identify her. Let me just put it that way. We brought the mother in, and of course, she had a response and a reaction to that. I would love to report to you that I did some of my greatest chaplaincy work in that moment and got that mother to understand and to see and to know and to get into the river of eternity and to swim and to flow and to let it go. But if that's what I was trying to do, I failed miserably. But I was not ashamed of myself, because you know what? That mother had a right to respond the way she did. And when the doctor tried to stop her, I stopped the doctor. Because I felt that her response was appropriate to what she was seeing. Now, I share that with you just because of what it was. But afterwards, that mother came to me and said, "Thank you." I said, "For what?" She said, "I don't remember all of it, but I'm glad you pulled that doctor away from me." Again, I wish I could tell you that I was so smart and so spiritually connected to God that God was piping me information every moment and I was getting it. But as I'm fond of saying, God knows me by my first name, and it's not because I'm so good either. But it's like my mama. I thought my first name was George Young. I got in so much trouble all the time. I didn't discover later that my first name was George and the last name was Young. But my mother would call me by my whole name whenever I got in trouble. After all of that, Harry, it was at least another 2 weeks when we met in the basement of St. Anthony's Hospital before they transferred. Again, they had the church that many things were going on, that people were coming in, and they had the area where we dealt with families. And that was a whole nother experience, dealing with families. Even 5-6 weeks later, there were still family members who were asking me, "Have they found my relative yet?" And saying, "I believe that they are still alive." I know my time is running low now, so I'll close with this. It was about a 2-week period that I was at the hospital all day and night, and never thought about it, never questioned it. It was part of what we were supposed to do. And at first we dealt with the folk who were sick, and then I had folk in the hospital who I was visiting, because some of those folk I saw when they came in, other folk I was dealing with, family members. And it was almost 2 weeks later, I was at church on Sunday and had not said anything about it. People knew I was involved in it, had not talked about it at all. And I got up, and it so happened, I've got a sister who had gone into ministry after me, who had come to visit my church that Sunday. And she was there, and I don't know, because she was there, and she's my older sister, and I looked up to her. But I got up to make some observation, and it struck me at that moment, the whole 2 weeks of what I had gone through. And I stood there for about 4 or 5 moments. And most of the folk know me. I'm not ever at a loss for words because I'm a pastor. But I didn't say anything. It was like a blank stare in my eyes from what I was told. And I started crying. And there was nobody said anything, did anything. And I cried until my wife came up and put her arms around me. And she was able to recognize that what I had gone through was now finally getting a place for me to be able to express it. I'll go back to what I started off earlier. Let me tell you, there is a beauty and benefit in grief. And because of the experience, it has been etched into my mind that when you do not have the ability to grieve properly, it has a way of stymieing your ability to fulfill who you are. If you don't get anything else from me, hear that. Grief is significant and it is important. And one of the things that I hold right now, that as a nation, I don't think that we have grieved properly over all of the things, including this tragic event in the history of our nation. If you ask me, and I love history, I don't think we've grieved over the Revolutionary War or the Civil War. I know we hadn't grieved over Vietnam. And when you don't grieve and make that grief an ongoing process, other things start getting in the way. And you end up with 7 deaths and 10 days. And if you're not careful, one of these days, those 7 deaths will come back upon you in a way that you'll not understand, because you have not properly grieved. And so my word to you is I pray that you will grieve over the losses in your life. But I thank you so much for being here, because you are in the process of grieving for all of those who had a loss, and grieving for yourself by taking the time to come and to share in a moment like this. Amen? Amen. Amen.